Welcome, friends, to my absolute favorite topic to talk about. That's rhetoric. Ladies and gentlemen, rhetoric is everywhere. It's everywhere, it's everything. You use it every day, you just don't call it rhetoric. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion. Rhetoric is how you say something, because really everything is very persuasive. So, rhetoric has three parts to it: logos, ethos, and pathos. And logos is the logical argument. Logos is whether or not your argument makes sense, whether or not your audience can understand it. Um, it provides reasons, it backs up with logical facts your argument. Ethos is the authority that you have, your credibility, whether or not we should believe you, whether or not you're an ethical person, whether or not we should say that you are right. Pathos, on the other hand, is the emotional appeal. It's tugging at your heartstrings. It's saying that it feels right, it must be right. It's trying to appeal to your more emotional side. So, everything is rhetorical, and I say that because I truly believe it. Um, Even form can be rhetorical. So, for example, cause and effect relationships, trying to persuade somebody that this cause led to this effect and providing backup for that, or explaining how something has changed over time, uh, saying that there's a huge history of a certain thing, that is very rhetorical, it's very persuasive. And so even the form, even the way that you say things, the information you choose to present and how you choose to present it can be rhetorical. And I think that we saw this in a couple of our readings. Specifically, if you look at the product placement and advergaming reading, you'll see that the author talks about a lot of different examples. And he does that because he wants to show you just how prevalent this form of advertising is in our society, because it's not something that maybe you would notice right away. Likewise, it might be difficult to notice exactly what the author is doing when he's giving you so many lists of product placement and advergaming. Rhetoric is also embedded in our language. As you hopefully know by now, connotation is something that can be very persuasive. So the very way that you say something, whether you talk about somebody sneaking around eavesdropping or somebody who simply overhears something, it's a very different meaning, very different connotation. My favorite example of this is back when George W. Bush's father was running for term. There was a smear campaign that was released by the opposition that said that Texas was the 48th worst education system in the United States. The 48th worst in the United States. So think about that for a second. Is that a negative thing or a positive thing? The 48th worst. Well, since there are only 50 states in the United States, isn't it the second best? If it's the 48th worst, wouldn't that make it the second best educational system in the United States? So in that campaign, they attempted to make something that was very positive, which is actually the very good education system, the successful education that people were receiving in that state, was turned into a negative, made it sound like it was actually one of the worst ones in the United States. And I think that's very interesting because it goes back to the whole concept of the glass being half full or half empty. Both are equally true. The glass is both half full and half empty, but it depends on how you present that information, what perspective, what rhetorical, persuasive way that you are presenting that information, um, how that supports your specific perspective and claim. So, the rhetorical situation. You probably didn't even know that there was a rhetorical situation, or maybe you did. You assumed that there would be a situation in which somebody needs to persuade somebody of something. After all, you have written a couple of papers, I'm going to guess, or at least you will. The rhetorical situation can be anything from a performer playing on a stage to you asking permission from your boss to take the afternoon off to you writing a paper for your teacher. So, for example, you start out, you have a purpose, and you have an audience. And those two things govern the rhetorical situation. So you would say something very differently to your friends, I would hope, than the way that you would say it to your teacher. So for example, if I'm going in for a job interview, I'm going to try to be very polite and strike a very formal tone because that's what my audience expects of me, and that will be more persuasive for that audience. So for that audience, I'm trying to highlight my ethos, trying to tell them it just makes sense to hire me. Right? But if I'm talking to my friends after the job interview, I can say, man, that was such a dope interview. I totally nailed it. I was crushing it the whole time. He was like, whoa, I totally got to give you this job because it sounds like you're broke. So those are two very different rhetorical situations. In the second situation, I'm much more casual because my friends expect me to be more casual in that situation. It's more appropriate for me to accentuate my pathos, how I felt during the interview. I felt like I crushed it, and to explain it in terms that my audience will understand, that is logical to them. So really, I hope you're starting to see how rhetoric truly is everything. And the reason why I have this picture here of the performer on stage is because even when you're going to a concert, even if you're going to see a movie or a play, you're going to notice that the surroundings are set up in a certain way. They're set up in a way that you would expect. For example, in a movie theater, you have the screen at the end and all the chairs facing the movie theater. Nobody expects the audience to turn around and watch the person reeling the movie or the machine that is showing the movie, through the little hole in the wall. When you go to a concert, you expect whoever you're going to see to come out on stage and perform. And that's your expectation. You probably have values as an audience member that you may not even consciously realize that you hold. So the next time that you go to a show, I hope that you think, man, that was a really excellent rhetorical situation. So every rhetorical situation starts out with a claim. Huh. Is there any other thing that starts out with a claim? Oh, that's right. Your essays. So you can think of a claim as a thesis statement for an argument. It's a stance that somebody who is arguing something takes. So you start out with this issue, and an issue is something about which people disagree. So let's say that it's how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, or maybe it's something a little bit bigger, like how to run a government. People are going to make certain claims, and then they're going to try to defend that claim. But before they can defend it, they have to make the claim clear first. So they have to say, well, I think it should be done this way. And then the rest of their argument is spent defending that position or claim. So a claim is the position that an author or a speaker takes on an issue. So the issue could be how to care for orchids. And you could have two different claims. Maybe one person thinks, oh, well, you should water them all the time. And the other person thinks, no, no, you should be much more careful when you water them. And then they'll each have to present evidence that defends that claim. So as you may have guessed, evidence is actually the most important part of making an argument. So when you are making an argument, you want to support that claim that you've made, that first step that you've made in taking a strong stance, and you want to provide very good evidence. And what makes your evidence good or bad is really how appropriate it is. So for example, like I said when I was going into my job interview, I wanted to provide the person who was interviewing me with evidence that I would be a good worker. Whereas later, when I was talking to my friends, I wanted to provide them with evidence that my interview went well. So it's really about what is appropriate for your audience, whether that's ethos, logos, or pathos. One of the finest examples of well-constructed argumentation is Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. It's a very long letter, but if you do want to look it up and read it, I would suggest it. It's the most perfect argument that I've ever read. He not only provides his authority and credibility as a community leader, as a pastor, as an educated man, but he also says it just makes sense. He says our economy will improve, our nation will work better if we're more united. We'll just be a better country altogether if we accept each other's differences, if we allow for diversity. And then he goes into the most powerful pathos audience. He talks about his children and about how he wants them to have the same opportunities and the same life that any other child has. And he really tugs at your heartstrings and has you imagine this child, this innocent girl who wants to have the opportunities that other children have, and yet they're denied to her. And so it's really one of the most powerful arguments that you can read. It's very well constructed, and hopefully it's convinced our entire nation today. So, where arguments break down are when they have faults in their logic, when they have fallacies and unfair appeals. So, let's start with the unfair emotional appeals. The first unfair emotional appeal is emotionally charged or biased language, and this is very easy to see. So, for example, if somebody is just so biased, if their language is just so strong, like maybe animalistic anger of the rioters or something like that, really invokes a very strong image. So that's not really the kind of language that you want to use when you're making an argument. You want to keep it more objective, more even keel. You want to avoid using things like pamper or indulge or refresh. These are, they're the kinds of words that you hear in advertisements and commercials, and they're very unfair in terms of argumentation. Another that you see a lot in commercials is false authority. So false authority is when they have celebrities who honestly don't really know a whole lot about, let's say, medicine. Like, for instance, Jessica Simpson, I think, um, she was there endorsing Proactive for a little while, and I don't think she ever went to dermatology school. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure she didn't. So false authority is when they use the opinion or action of a well-known or familiar person, a celebrity, and they endorse, something like that they have no background on, something they don't really understand. Another emotional appeal, which is sort of similar, is association. So, for example, this is when people say, oh, well, buy our product because it's the most American, that sort of thing, where they associate their product with something that is already widely accepted or supported. Another appeal is for people who, I like to think of it as the opposite of false authority. It's the appeal to common folk. So it's for people who um, believe that well-educated or wealthy people are untrustworthy, and so they try to convince their audience that it's an opinion held by the average Joe, so to speak, or the common man. Another one that's very similar, again, is join the crowd appeal, or what I like to call jumping on the bandwagon. And that appeal basically says, well, everybody else is doing it, so why don't you? And my mom always used to defeat this very easily. She'd say, well, if everybody else jumped off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge? And of course, my answer was, depends on how high the bridge is. The final unfair emotional appeal is ad hominem. And ad hominem is Latin for at the person, which basically means that you're not attacking the argument, you're attacking the person who holds the argument. So, for example, if a vegetarian says something like it's wrong to eat animals, then you say, well, vegetarians are stupid, and you just move on. So that's an unfair emotional appeal that's not a valid argument. Finally, errors in logical reasoning. Circular reasoning is one of the easier ones, I think, to identify, because it's basically saying, well, he can't do the job because he can't do the job. So it's using the conclusion as the evidence, and that's not a very good argument. Another one is hasty generalization. Hasty generalization basically groups people into these broad sweeping categories. So it says something like all students are lazy and they don't do things, which of course is not true. Everybody's individual, and so therefore that is a fallacy. Another is non sequitur. Non sequitur is basically a Latin phrase for it does not follow, and it's very similar to false cause. Non sequitur and false cause are essentially the same fallacy. False cause fallacy just basically means that there's an incorrect assumption that two events follow each other. So, for all of you math nerds out there, this is the concept that causation does not necessarily, or correlation does not necessarily imply causation. Or, in terms of non sequitur, a false cause and effect. So, where one thing does not necessarily lead to another. Finally, we have either or fallacy. So either or fallacy forces people to think that there is really only one of two ways something can go. Either you're with us or you're against us. Either you're a Democrat or you're a communist. Either you're a vegetarian or you do nothing but eat meat, you're a carnivore. So that's obviously false because in a lot of cases there is gray area and there are more than one option for everyone. So that is this presentation. If you have any questions or if you need anything, feel free to contact me and let me know how you think about your rhetorical situations from now on.